Imagine this scene, Tokyo, 1978. It was supposed to be an intellectual heavyweight match. In one corner, you have Takaaki Yoshimoto, Japan's most influential and controversial thinker. In the other, the French superstar philosopher Michel Foucault is on a visit, and a historic dialogue has been arranged. Yoshimoto begins to patiently lay out one of his central theories, that the state, this thing we see is so powerful and concrete, is ultimately a collective fantasy, a kind of story we all agree to believe in. On the other side of the table, Foucault, a man who dedicated his life to dissecting the very real, physical mechanisms of power, the prisons, the clinics, the institutions, is polite, but visibly baffled. The two men talk past each other. Their ideas never meet. The dialogue is a legendary failure, a moment that shocked the Japanese intellectual world. The conclusion many drew at the time was simple. Yoshimoto's idea was just too abstract, too uniquely Japanese for the concrete, realist Western mind to grasp. It was a cultural and philosophical impasse. Then fast forward about 4 decades, a book called Sapiens by an Israeli historian becomes a global phenomenon.
Its author, Yuval Noah Harari, is praised for his groundbreaking central thesis that human society is built upon shared fictions like nations, money, and laws. It's presented as a brilliant new discovery. But for anyone who remembered that failed dialogue in 1978, it felt less like a discovery, more like a strange, unsettling echo from the past. That opening really sets the stage, doesn't it? It's quite a picture.
It really is. A moment frozen in time, almost.
So today, we're launching into a deep dive that really goes beyond just those two thinkers, or, that one famously failed conversation.
Right.
Our mission here is to explore the intriguing, sometimes honestly kind of funny, ways that profoundly similar ideas can just pop up.
Yeah, independently.
In completely separate cultural spheres. We're going to dig into how language, the specific history around an idea, and these deep-seated cultural ways of seeing things can create these huge gaps.
Chasms, really.
Exactly, chasms. Even when people seem to be talking about the exact same thing.
Yeah.
And maybe most importantly, we'll think about what all this means for how we, you, me, everyone, how we experience what we call reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's a story about ideas so fundamental, so powerful. They apparently had to be discovered not just once, but twice.
It's an intellectual whodunit. In a way, but the mystery isn't really who said it first.
Right.
It's more like, why did it take so long for these echoes to cross the intellectual oceans? Or, why did they need rediscovering at all? It really speaks to the unique pathways of thought that exist globally, often in isolation from each other.
I love that framing an intellectual whodunit. It leads us right into our first big point.
Yeah.
Trying to understand that strange, unsettling echo itself, this remarkable parallel discovery.
Yeah.
So let's start with one of the key players, Takaaki Yoshimoto. For anyone not familiar, he was, a towering figure in post-war Japanese thought. Way more than just a philosopher.
Oh, absolutely.
He was a poet, a really sharp literary critic, and he became this genuine intellectual prophet for the New Left movement in Japan. This was during the really turbulent 1960s and 70s.
A very intense period.
Totally. And he wasn't some academic shut away in an ivory tower. He was a vibrant, engaged public intellectual. You'd find him right there, at the front lines of movements, pushing writers to confront their wartime responsibilities, rallying students in these massive anti-treaty protests.
I remember reading he even famously jumped onto a truck once.
Yeah. To deliver impromptu lectures to activists gathered outside the National Diet compound in Tokyo. Just an electrifying presence.
He really was. And at the core, the intellectual heart of Yoshimoto's really expansive thinking was his big idea, what he called collective fantasy. In Japanese, kyugensu.
Kyugensu.
Right. He laid this out most thoroughly in his really influential book, The Theory of Collective Fantasy, which came out in 1968.
Okay.
And Yoshimoto basically proposed that these fundamental aspects of society, things we often just take for granted as real objective things like the state itself or even deeply held religious beliefs, they aren't objective facts out there.
Concrete things.
Not in the way we usually think. Instead, he argued, they're products of shared conceptual systems, sort of like communal stories that groups of people hold.
Okay, stories we tell ourselves.
Exactly. And these systems, these fantasies, they transcend individual minds. They form this powerful shared illusion that binds people together, shaping how they act, how they see the world. Now, Yoshimoto identified as a Marxist, right? But his take on collective fantasy was pretty radical for the time. He really leaned into this profoundly subjective view.
Subjective.
How so? Well, he used it to break free from what he saw as the more rigid, deterministic side of later Marxist thought, where economic forces were seen as dictating pretty much everything.
Ah, okay. Less deterministic.
Right. He was trying to carve out space for human agency, for individual liberation. Even within these incredibly powerful collective illusions, he was looking for ways for individuals to think and act autonomously, even when they're swimming in these shared narratives.
So trying to find freedom within the fantasy, in a sense.
Precisely. A different kind of freedom.
Okay, so that's Yoshimoto in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
Then boom, fast forward 4 decades, and almost like out of the blue, Yuval Noah Harari steps onto the global stage. His book, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind. It hits the shelves in 2011, and it just explodes.
It really did. Everywhere.
Became this massive international bestseller, translated out of tons of languages, a genuine global sensation. Suddenly, millions of people all over the world had this compelling new way to look at not just their own history, but like the whole sweep of human civilization.
Yeah, it gave people a framework.
Totally. Harari became a household name, basically synonymous with this fresh perspective on what makes us human.
And Harari's central thesis in Sapiens is, well, it's strikingly, almost uncannily similar to Yoshimoto's.
Right. It's weird.
Harari argues that large-scale human cooperation, which, let's face it, is what allowed Homo sapiens to spread across the whole planet and eventually dominate it.
A key advantage.
Exactly. He says it's built entirely on what he calls shared fictions. Fictions. These are essentially stories we tell ourselves and each other. Narratives about abstract stuff like gods, the whole idea of a nation, why money has value, the legal status of corporations, even things like human rights.
So things that aren't physically real.
Precisely. For Harari, these things exist purely in our collective imagination. He sees the whole evolutionary process of human institutions throughout history as this series of system changes, each one driven by creating and getting widespread belief in these shared fictions.
So the stories change, the system changes.
That's the idea. He'd argue that at major turning points like the cognitive revolution, the agricultural revolution, the scientific revolution, what fundamentally shifted was our human capacity for believing in and spreading these elaborate, mutually agreed upon stories.
Okay.
And that's what allowed societies to operate on bigger and bigger, more complex scales.
The striking similarity between Yoshimoto's collective fantasy and Harari's fictions is just, it's wild, isn't it?
It really is.
It's almost like certain ideas are just so fundamental to understand how humans operate that they're sort of destined to emerge.
Like convergent evolution in biology.
Exactly. Like two completely separate species on different continents, totally independent paths, but they both develop, I don't know, flight or echolocation. It makes you wonder how many other intellectual dinosaurs are out there, waiting to be rediscovered in different cultural contexts, or how many big insights we're missing just because they haven't crossed the language or cultural border.
It's truly remarkable. And what makes it even more fascinating, maybe even a bit awkward, is that Harari developed his fiction argument completely unaware of Yoshimoto's work.
Oh, wait, you didn't know?
Apparently not. He asserted his own originality, which, just makes us acutely aware of how little Japanese thought, despite its really profound contributions, philosophy, literature, social theory, how little of it has actually permeated the Western intellectual world.
Wow.
Yoshimoto's theories, forged in the Japanese language, deeply influenced by Japan's specific post-war experience and intellectual traditions, they just didn't get written onto the wider global map of intellectual history.
So they stayed kind of local.
Largely, yes. It's a powerful testament to these closed worlds of intellectual discussion that still exist. Groundbreaking ideas can be discovered, debated intensely in one sphere, and remain almost totally unknown in another.
To give you a real feel for this unique intellectual thing, listen to this experience. It was in a cluttered Jimbocho bookshop, the air thick with the scent of aging paper, that I first felt the ghost. I had spent my postgraduate years submerged in Yoshimoto Takaaki, wrestling with his dense prose on Kidu Ginsu, the collective fantasy. It felt like a secret knowledge, a theory forged in the specific fire and shame of post-war Japan, explaining how a nation could be bound by illusions.
You can almost smell it, can't you? That old paper smell, the weight of those ideas just hanging in the air. It's like the history is right there.
Then I saw the bestseller stack near the entrance, Yuval Noah Harari's Sapiens, translated into crisp, accessible Japanese. I bought it out of curiosity.
And there it is, Sapiens, just sitting there, waiting.
Reading it on the train home was a dizzying experience. Harari's fictions, money, nations, laws were the same force, the same invisible architecture Yoshimoto had mapped.
The same basic idea.
Exactly. But Harari's tone was so different. Like a biologist observing a successful adaptation, it was functional, almost cheerful. Yoshimoto's was the cry of a poet trying to break the spell, to find a way for the individual to stand apart from the crushing fantasy.
Wow. What a moment that must have been, realizing you'd encountered this core concept before, but through such a different emotional and philosophical lens.
I wasn't angry at the similarity. I felt a profound, lonely echo across decades and cultures. An idea so potent that it had to bloom twice, once in the shadows of my country's past, and again in the bright, globalized light of the present. The world had finally discovered the ghost, but I wondered if they could feel its haunting weight.
That phrase, lonely echo, really captures it, doesn't it? It's beautiful and sad at the same time. And we can definitely connect both of these theories, Yoshimoto's collective fantasy and Harari's fictions, to the broader stream of thought called social constructivism.
Okay, social constructivism. Break that down a bit.
Sure, it's basically a philosophical perspective that argues that reality, especially social reality, isn't just objectively there. It's constructed, built through human interaction, shared language, cultural history.
So we make it real by agreeing it's real.
In a nutshell, yes. And both Yoshimoto and Harari take what's called a subjectivist nominalist position.
Okay, that's a mouthful.
It is. But it basically means they argue things like the state, money, corporations, they don't have some inherent objective reality out there separate from us.
Right.
Their existence, their solidity, it depends entirely on our collective minds believing they exist, giving them names, giving them meaning. They basically reduce these seemingly solid institutions and the order they create entirely to human mental activity.
So it's all in our heads, collectively.
Pretty much. And while Harari's insights might seem more modern, he sprinkles in references to neuroscience and evolutionary psychology.
Yeah, feels very current.
Right. But the core framework of his thought, conceptually, it's almost identical to Yoshimoto's. It's like the same engine, maybe just with a shinier coat of paint and different cultural references bolted on.
That's a really powerful way to put it. Same engine, different paint job.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's circle back to that legendary failed dialogue in 1978.
The famous non-meeting of minds.
Exactly. It's not just a funny story about two super smart guys totally missing each other's points. It's actually this profound case study in the huge challenges of cross-cultural philosophical chat and how easily misunderstandings can pop up even when you think you're using the same words. It just highlights how deeply philosophical ideas are stuck in their own history and language.
Absolutely. Yoshimoto, like we said, talked about the state as a collective fantasy, this abstract thing, a product of the spirit almost, something you could maybe transcend through a big shift in consciousness. His view was really rooted in a more communal, almost spiritual understanding of power, something that, for him, came before the modern bureaucratic political machines of the West.
Predating the modern state structure.
Right. And it wasn't just purely mental for him either. He argued this collective fantasy actively creates the structural bodies that organize society. So it's a mix of social constructivism and maybe systems theory.
Okay, so it has real effects, it builds things.
Yes, he saw it as the underlying framework, the very reason a nation could be held together by these seemingly unreal yet incredibly powerful collective beliefs.
So he's looking for that deeper, maybe spiritual source of social glue, not just physical force.
Exactly. But then you have Foucault.
Right. And the power knowledge.
Exactly. And he was deeply, profoundly embedded in a very Western tradition of looking at material stuff, at institutions. For him, the state wasn't some floaty fantasy. It was concrete, physical, an apparatus. Think of the actual bricks and mortar of prisons, the standardized practices in clinics, the systems of surveillance everywhere, specific institutions like schools, hospitals.
The nuts and bolts of control.
Yes, and the very discourses, the ways we talk and think about things that shape our behavior and what counts as knowledge. For Foucault, power was tangible. It was a real mechanism that physically organizes and coerces people's bodies and lives, not just a belief or an abstract idea floating around.
He was all about the micro-level stuff, how power gets into everyday life.
Precisely. And that's where the conceptual collision just happened. Bam. A truly fascinating moment of intellectual stalemate.
Yeah.
This clash was so striking for the Japanese intellectual world back then. It led many of them to conclude that Yoshimoto's view of the state must be inherently Japanese, too unique, maybe too abstract for Western perspectives to really grab onto.
So the feeling was they just don't get it.
Kind of. The words might have been translated as state or power, but the concepts underneath, the meaning, the history baked into those words, they were worlds apart. It wasn't just a language barrier. It was a conceptual Grand Canyon.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of Foucault's work, initially, he was mostly focused on understanding how power works through these concrete mechanisms and practices, right? Especially from like the 17th to 19th centuries.
The rise of disciplinary society.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Later in his career, he did broaden out his analysis. He explored what he called governmentality.
Right, governmentality, which isn't just about the government.
No, it's much bigger. It refers to the whole system, institutions, procedures, analyses, reflections, calculations, tactics, the whole shebang by which populations are governed.
The conduct of conduct.
Right. This definitely expanded his analysis of power to include bigger structures, the state itself. He saw the state not as this single solid thing, but as a technology of government, always defining and redefining what it's responsible for, how it manages and controls populations.
But even with that broader view, his focus stayed pretty firmly on the mechanisms and the practices, the tangible workings, the specific techniques of power, not the underlying fantasy of its existence, or that communal spiritual force that Yoshimoto was getting at.
Imagine being the poor interpreter stuck in the middle of that, trying to translate concepts that carry completely different historical baggage, different cultural weight.
Oh, nightmare fuel for an interpreter.
This is where it gets really interesting and honestly deeply humbling. Listen to this account from someone who was there. As a young interpreter in 1978, my greatest pride was my fluency. I believed language was a bridge, and I was its engineer. Then Michel Foucault came to dialogue with Takaaki Yoshimoto. The room was small, the intellectual gravity immense. Foucault, sharp and precise, began to speak of l'état, the state. The word in my mind was clear, a concept of power, discipline, and institutions I'd learned in Paris. I turned to Yoshimoto and, with confidence, translated it as kuka.
Kuka, the standard word for state. Seems straightforward.
That's what I thought. But a subtle shift occurred, a silence that was not about comprehension, but about distance.
Ooh, that silence, you know immediately something's not connecting. It's the moment the interpreter realizes just swapping words isn't enough, not nearly enough.
Yoshimoto's reply was meandering, rooted in the soil of the emperor system, of community, of a force that was almost spiritual, something that predated the modern political machine Foucault described. I translated back and forth, but the words were just vessels, crossing an ocean but arriving empty of their native context. Foucault's state was a cage of logic. Yoshimoto's koka was a communal dream.
Wow. A cage of logic versus a communal dream. That captures the gap perfectly.
In that room, I felt the limits of my craft. I was not building a bridge. I was merely pointing out the chasm between two continents of thought. The dialogue was deemed a polite failure, but for me it was a terrifying, humbling success. It taught me that the deepest truths are not universal, but are carved into the very structure of a language and the history it carries.
What a powerful, personal way to illustrate the whole problem. It really makes you pause and reconsider how universal any concept really is, doesn't it?
Totally.
It's a stark reminder that translation is never just about finding the right word. It's about trying to translate entire worlds of meaning, history, unspoken assumptions. Sometimes the bridge just isn't there.
That story just drives home the point about these conceptual chasms. Okay, so beyond the fascinating resonance of their core ideas fantasy, fiction, what's really compelling, is how Yoshimoto and Harari drew completely different conclusions from their similar insights.
Right. The implications they drew are worlds apart.
Yoshimoto saw this collective fantasy as something to be critically dismantled, like a spell you need to break for individual liberation. Harari, though, he views fiction as this ingenious, almost miraculous tool for human progress, the very foundation of our species' success story.
You're absolutely right that divergence in their conclusions is crucial for understanding the full weight of their ideas. Yoshimoto's collective fantasy definitely has this strong emancipatory vibe. It's geared towards freedom.
Emancipatory, meaning setting people free.
Exactly. He was aiming for juritsusei. It's a Japanese term. kind of means radical self-reliance or autonomy, freedom from these powerful societal constraints.
Okay.
He was actively trying to push back against what he saw as those deterministic tendencies in Marxism, trying to find a path for individual autonomy within this system of shared illusions. For him, the goal was achieving a kind of intellectual and spiritual independence from the collective's grip.
Getting free from the groupthink?
Kind of, yeah. But in stark contrast, Harari, even though he acknowledges that these fictions are arbitrary, made up.
Right. He admits they're not real.
Yeah, but he tends to view them functionally, and in many ways positively. He really emphasizes their indispensable role in enabling large-scale human cooperation, social integration.
So for Harari, they're useful illusions.
Very useful. For him, these fictions aren't some trap to escape from. They're the very mechanism that let us build cities, nations, global economies. He sees them as this innovative operating system that allowed Homo sapiens to succeed as a species.
It's like one sees the Matrix as a prison, the other sees it as a necessary operating system.
That's a great analogy, yeah.
To really see this in action, let's imagine what it feels like to kind of live both of these perspectives at the same time. My job is to create fictions. As a brand strategist, I help build the collective story that makes thousands of employees work together and millions of consumers believe in a logo. I live and breathe Harari's theory without ever having read him. Our fictions are practical. They create value, they build empires, they facilitate large-scale cooperation. My career is a testament to the power of this shared belief.
That's a perfect real-world example of Harari's functional view, isn't it? How these collective agreements directly lead to tangible results in our modern economy.
But on weekends, I read, lately it's been fragments of Yoshimoto, translated in obscure academic journals. He talks about collective fantasy not as a tool, but as a trap. He speaks of jiritsu, a kind of radical self-reliance, the struggle to find one's own thought, free from the illusions the collective imposes.
Ah, the counterpoint.
Now I see two worlds. In board meetings, I see the functional fiction at work. But on my commute home, looking at the ads and the faces of the crowd, I feel Yoshimoto's chill. I see the fantasy that holds us, and I feel a desperate urge to find the edge of it. Harari gave me a framework for my job, but Yoshimoto gave me a name for my soul's quiet rebellion. I'm a builder of the cage, and my secret obsession is finding the key to my own door.
Wow. Builder of the cage, finding the key to my own door. That really captures the tension, doesn't it? That internal struggle between what makes society work and what might be limiting the individual.
Yeah.
But, despite how fascinating their insights are and how different their conclusions, criticisms can definitely be leveled at both theories.
Okay, like what?
Well, one issue is a potential conceptual ambiguity. If the state is just a collective fantasy, then what is the state, really, in any objective sense? It gets a bit fuzzy.
How so?
Both theories can sometimes feel a bit tautological. Circular reasoning.
Tautological, meaning it just explains itself.
Kind of. Imagine asking, why is this brand of coffee so popular? And the answer is, because people believe it's the best. Okay, but why do they believe it's the best? Well, because it's a popular brand. See the loop.
Right. A causes B because B causes A.
Exactly. With collective fantasy or fictions, if you ask, why is the state a collective fantasy? The answer might be because people believe in it. Okay, and why do people believe? Because there's a fantasy called the state. It leaves the core concept a bit undefined, circling back on itself, which can be a real headache if you're trying to pin down its origins or how it actually works.
And that circularity makes it hard to actually analyze or change things.
Right.
Because you're just stuck in the loop.
Precisely. And another potential weakness is that they both can be a bit weak on capturing societal dynamism. How societies change.
Dynamism, meaning movement, change.
Yeah. Their arguments often paint this picture of a collective subjective structure. The fantasy, the fiction, almost like it's a fixed thing, an unchanging background. But they don't always dig deep into how these structures actually get generated, how they collapse, or how they transition into totally new orders.
Because society isn't static. It's constantly shifting, evolving. We see it all the time.
Exactly. It's not a fixed backdrop. To understand this better, maybe think of it like a field in physics, like an electromagnetic field.
Okay. How does that apply?
Well, a field isn't just passive background space, right? It's a real entity. It has energy, it mediates forces, it makes particles interact, it has properties, it exerts influence.
Yeah.
So maybe in society, we can think of a field as this potential space where institutions, the economy, culture, technology, they all interact. It's a dynamic energy that creates new orders.
Okay, like different forces interacting.
Yeah. For instance, think about a startup company growing really fast. It hits problems because its internal and external field is changing market pressures, new tech, more employees. It needs new structures, new HR systems.
But it has to adapt to real pressures.
Exactly. These changes don't happen just because people believe harder in the company mission. They're a product of all these elements interacting within that dynamic field. And crucially, real-world stuff like epidemics, natural disasters, climate change, wars, famines, economic crashes, new technologies. These things shake society from outside the realm of pure fantasy or fiction.
They're external shocks.
Right. These external pressures don't just shift beliefs, they force the creation of new institutions, new narratives. Without looking at that interaction with the real external world, the theories stay a bit limited, stuck inside their subjective or nominalist boxes. The full picture of social change gets missed.
So you pointed out some really interesting conceptual challenges for both thinkers, the circular logic, the missing dynamism. It suggests maybe their ideas of fantasy or fiction, while powerful, aren't quite the whole story.
Potentially, yeah.
And this leads us to a really fascinating angle on the concept of fantasy itself. Not just as, a simple illusion, but looking at it from a critical political theory perspective.
Okay.
This view gives us maybe a deeper understanding of its power, its dangers, and maybe why these shared stories are so darn persistent. Why maybe that Foucault-Yoshimoto chat was doomed.
How so?
Well, from this perspective, fantasy isn't just an illusion, and it's not automatically bad. Think of it more like a mental safety net. A comforting story we tell ourselves.
A necessary story.
Maybe it serves as this fundamental framing device. It protects us from the anxiety that maybe there's no ultimate objective guarantee underpinning our social world.
The fear of chaos, maybe?
Exactly. It provides the schema, the underlying framework that bridges the gap between our public ideals, what we say we believe in, and the, let's say, darker side of our desires. The stuff we'd rather not consciously admit.
The unspoken stuff.
Right, which is precisely why certain parts of these collective narratives often resist being openly talked about. They can be socially taboo or just deeply unsettling.
And this becomes really clear when you see collective reactions to events that seem disproportionately emotional, almost irrational.
Yeah, like when?
Well, think about situations where there's this collective feeling of vulnerability or threat, and it leads to maybe a group defined by nationality or background or beliefs being cast as this urgent threat to our deeply held way of life.
Scapegoating.
Often, yeah. And this is where certain kinds of implicit messaging in politics, sometimes called dog whistling, becomes so effective. Messages are sent out that seem harmless on the surface, but underneath, they're tapping directly into these shared underlying collective fantasies. For example, subtly suggesting immigrants are to blame for economic problems or are somehow stealing our way of life.
Playing on those hidden fears and stories.
Exactly. So the real problem, from this view, isn't fantasy itself, which is probably a natural part of how humans think and form groups, but a really strong overinvestment in it, a rigid attachment.
Being too attached to the story.
Right. This overinvestment can make us interpret everything through this fixed, predetermined template. It blocks what you might call open creativity, exploring alternative possibilities. It leads to a kind of closed creativity where new challenges just get forced into the same old patterns of anxiety or entitlement.
So what's fascinating here is that the idea of crossing the fantasy in a psychoanalytic sense doesn't mean getting rid of fantasy altogether. You don't have to stop believing in shared stories.
Doesn't sound possible, really.
Probably not. Instead, it means loosening its grip, changing our relationship to the fantasy so we're less enthralled by it, less rigidly bound by its narratives.
Becoming more aware of the story, maybe.
Yeah, and being able to embrace ambiguity, uncertainty, opening up space for new political paths, creative solutions, instead of being stuck repeating the same old comfortable but maybe limiting story. It's a call for more intellectual flexibility, a more fluid way of engaging with the shared stories that shape our world. #Tech4. The historical context of categories and translation in Japan.
And this idea of ingrained narratives, of fixed templates, brings us powerfully back to that historical clash we started with, the Foucault-Yoshimoto dialogue.
Right.
That feeling of an unsettling echo back in 1978 for Japanese intellectuals. It wasn't just a one-off weird moment. It's actually part of a much larger, incredibly complex, and totally fascinating story.
Which is?
It's the story of how Western ideas, especially these big, abstract philosophical categories, basically crashed into and fundamentally reshaped Japanese thought during the Meiji period. That started way back in 1868.
It really was like a conceptual earthquake, wasn't it? A collision of intellectual worlds.
Absolutely. In the 19th century, as Japan was rapidly modernizing, opening up to the West, all these terms like science, religion, philosophy were imported wholesale.
Okay.
The immediate problem, there were no direct Japanese equivalents for these abstract categories. They just didn't map neatly onto existing Japanese ways of thinking or organizing knowledge.
So square pegs, round holes.
Exactly. This led to these immense intellectual puzzles, huge debates, and a profound reshuffling and reclassification of existing knowledge. Take philosophy, for example. Nishimane, a really pivotal intellectual figure back then.
The guy who translated substance.
That's him. He coined the term tetsugaku for philosophy.
Tetsugaku. Okay.
But here's the fascinating thing. He and others like Nake Chonmin initially argued that philosophy, in the Western sense, simply didn't exist in Japan before 1868.
They said Japan had no philosophy.
In that specific Western mold, yeah. For them, Tetsugaku was strictly for Western thought. Indigenous, pre-Meiji intellectual traditions. That was just shish thought, not philosophy.
Wow. That's kind of brutal.
It is. And it's a stark contrast to how, say, Chinese philosophy is widely accepted globally, right? It includes Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism traditions that were initially denied the philosophy label in Japan itself, even though they were hugely influential there too. Imagine the cultural anxiety being told your entire rich intellectual heritage doesn't qualify as proper philosophy.
Yeah, that must have stung. And it wasn't just philosophy, right? You mentioned religion, too.
Oh yeah, religion caused just as much, if not more, conceptual scrambling. When the category religion was introduced, mainly through treaties in the late 1850s, it often carried with it a very specific model.
Like a Western model.
Predominantly a Protestant Christian model, yeah. Emphasizing specific beliefs over practices, needing a distinct clergy, a personal relationship with God. This immediately set up a framework for what counted as religion.
So if you didn't fit the mold,
you might not be seen as a real religion. And as a result, from the 1880s onward, religion in Japan largely got pushed into the irrational and private sphere, often explicitly set against science, or even against patriotic loyalty to the emperor and the state.
Interesting. So religion became private, irrational.
Largely, yeah. And what's really noteworthy is Shinto, the indigenous spiritual practices, deeply rooted in Japanese culture.
Right.
It was deliberately shaped into a national ideology and initially was not classified under the category of religion.
Shinto wasn't a religion.
Not according to the state classification at the time. It was deemed something else tied to national identity, imperial rights, deliberately separating it from those imported Western religions. It was a very political move.
Wow. So this created a huge challenge for traditions like Buddhism and Confucianism, didn't it? They'd been around for centuries, covering ethics, philosophy, rituals.
Exactly. Suddenly they're facing this question, are we philosophy or are we religion, according to these new imported boxes?
What a mess.
It was. And many influential Japanese thinkers like Inu and Kyozawa Manshi, they strongly believed that Buddhism and Confucianism were, or at least included, philosophy. They weren't just going to discard centuries of profound intellectual heritage and say, oh, I guess it wasn't philosophy after all, just because it didn't fit a new Western label. It was a real intellectual identity crisis.
So how did they respond? What did they do?
Well, Inu, for instance, he responded directly to this challenge. In 1887, he founded the Philosophy Hall, the Tetsugaken Philosophy Hall. It eventually became Toyo University, and this was an institution where they taught not just Western philosophy, but also specifically Buddhist philosophy, Confucian philosophy, and even Kokugaku, traditional Japanese studies, all side by side.
Okay, so integrating them.
Exactly. His explicit goal was, and I quote loosely, to separate the philosophical parts and the religious parts that exist in Buddhism, and then reconstruct Buddhism as a developing philosophy, adapting it to these new Western categories while simultaneously insisting on its intellectual rigor.
Try and make it fit, but also prove its worth.
Right. And Kyozawa Manshi, another key figure, also believed Buddhism needed to be reinterpreted using a universal philosophical language. He even argued that Western philosophy itself was culturally conditioned, so it wasn't the only game in town.
Turning the tables a bit.
Kind of. Their motivation seems pretty clear. Proving Japan had a philosophy ideally, one that wasn't just a copy but could stand alongside, maybe even surpass, Western philosophy. This was a matter of huge cultural prestige, national pride, self-assertion on the world stage. They were trying to stake Japan's claim in the global intellectual big leagues.
And this whole translation issue goes even deeper, doesn't it? down to specific words, like you mentioned substance earlier. When Nishiyamane translated substance as jitai,
Yeah, jitai.
he wasn't just finding an equivalent word. He was basically taking an old Japanese word and loading it up with a whole new philosophical weight it never had before,
Yeah.
grafting a Western concept onto it.
And this is exactly where the subtle differences become these huge pitfalls. It shapes how ideas are understood across cultures, often without anyone even realizing the gap, the linguistic chasm that formed centuries ago.
So what did jitai originally mean?
Originally, jitai meant something like true form or essence, maybe the real body of something. Nishi mapped the Western substance onto this idea of a true body or true thing.
Okay, seems close enough.
But here's the rub. The Greek word ousia, which is where the Western concept of substance largely comes from.
Ousia.
Right. It's rooted in the verb to be. Fundamentally, it means what X is, its being, its essence. It doesn't necessarily mean existence as this self-contained, independent, material thing.
Okay. More about its nature than its thingness.
Kind of. Even hypokaimenon in Aristotle, often translated as substratum and linked to substance, literally means lying as a foundation, usually in the context of something changing. It doesn't mean an independent, static thing that exists all by itself.
So translating ousia as jitai, as this true body, could actually mislead people.
Fundamentally mislead them, yeah. Especially if they only ever encounter Aristotle through translation. Imagine trying to build, I don't know, a complex legal system where the word for contract in one language basically means a friendly suggestion in the other.
Right. Disaster.
It creates these deep, often invisible conceptual misunderstandings that just ripple through philosophical thinking for generations. The very idea of a stable, underlying substance, as it's often understood in modern Western thought, becomes this constructed understanding. It's not a direct, clean translation of the original Greek concept at all.
So this whole complicated backstory, the translation choices, the interpretations, the categorization battles, it sheds a huge amount of light on why that Foucault-Yoshimoto dialogue in 1978 was such a spectacular non-event.
Exactly. They weren't just missing each other on one concept like the state. They were operating from fundamentally different intellectual universes, forged by decades, even centuries, of separate conceptual evolution. Each tradition had its own baggage, its own built-in biases, its own blind spots baked right into the very words they were using.
It was almost, in hindsight, destined to be a missed connection from the very start.
Sadly, yes. The bridge just wasn't built yet. Maybe it still isn't. Hashtag tagged 5. The enduring power and perils of shared beliefs.
It's those deep historical roots that make this kind of deep dive so important, right? For understanding how ideas travel or why they sometimes just don't travel across borders.
Absolutely. So we've journeyed through this really intricate intellectual landscape. We've seen these remarkable parallel discoveries, these conceptual clashes born from the very fabric of language and history. What then is the big takeaway from all this for us today?
Well, for me, the most striking thing is how both Yoshimoto and Harari, working completely separately, different cultures, different times, no knowledge of each other, they both arrived at this incredibly profound insight.
Which is?
That shared imaginative constructs, collective fantasies, fictions, whatever you call them, are unbelievably powerful in organizing human society. They're not just abstract fluff. They are the invisible architecture of our world, the very fabric of our social reality.
They make the world go round, in a sense.
Totally. But then there's the split, where Harari sees them as this remarkably functional basis for large-scale cooperation, for species survival, almost like a genius adaptation.
Just success story.
Right. Yoshimoto views them much more critically, as a potential trap, a spell from which individuals need to seek liberation, that jiritsusei, that radical self-reliance.
So it's the difference between embracing the spell because it holds society together and trying to find a way to break free from it.
Exactly. Embracing the operating system versus trying to hack it for individual freedom.
And the fact that Harari apparently didn't know about Yoshimoto really highlights a significant truth about global intellectual history. So much of it still happens in these closed worlds, silos.
Yeah.
The rediscovery or this accidental overlap of such a fundamental idea, collective fantasy, fictions it could have been, it should have been, this amazing opportunity for East and West to have deeper, richer conversation.
A real dialogue this time.
Exactly. It could have forced both sides to refine their theories, confront their blind spots, expand their scope, maybe leading to a richer, more genuinely universal understanding.
But that didn't really happen on a global scale.
No. Harari's work was largely presented as this brand new, brilliant Western revelation, not really positioned as a convergence of thought across different traditions, and we're still kind of grappling with the implications of these intellectual silos today.
It really is a shame. It feels like we're still missing out on so much of the global intellectual tapestry, constantly rediscovering things instead of building on shared insights from everywhere. And this whole struggle to categorize, to define, to reconcile local thought with imported Western ideas. It wasn't just abstract philosophical navel-gazing either, was it?
Yeah.
It had real, tangible results, things you could see and touch.
Absolutely. Think about Inouye Tree again. His remarkable temple of philosophy, the Tetsugakudo in Tokyo.
Yeah, the philosophy hall you mentioned.
Yeah. Outwardly, it looks like a Buddhist temple, traditional architecture, peaceful gardens, but it's explicitly dedicated to philosophy.
That's wild.
Its main hall celebrates four great sages, Socrates and Kant from the West, and Buddha and Confucius from the East, enshrined together as philosophical figures.
Wow. East meets West, literally enshrined.
Exactly. And get this, it was originally intended to be just the first temple in a whole nationwide religion of philosophy complex.
Religion of philosophy. Seriously.
Seriously. It was a literal physical manifestation of this huge intellectual battle to broaden the definition of Tetsugaku, of philosophy, a super ambitious attempt to formulate a superior Japanese philosophy that could seamlessly integrate Asian thought into a global framework.
What happened to it?
Well, today it's basically just a quiet, somewhat forgotten park, largely invisible on Western academic maps, a kind of silent witness to this past intellectual ferment. But what a powerful symbol it is, a legacy of incredible dynamism, intellectual ambition. It speaks volumes about that era when the very foundations of knowledge were being fought over and redefined, often with this urgent sense of cultural pride, trying desperately to bridge these vast conceptual divides.
So we've explored these echoes of thought bouncing across oceans and time. We've witnessed the immense challenges when different intellectual traditions try, and sometimes fail, to speak the same language. And we've really considered how deeply we're all shaped by the shared stories we collectively create and crucially believe in.
Yeah. And the power of these collective fantasies or fictions, it remains just immense. Whether you see them as the invisible glue holding together our complex, functional societies, or as this subtly woven spell from which we constantly need to strive for individual autonomy, their influence is just undeniable.
It really leaves us with a truly thought-provoking idea to chew on, doesn't it? Consider how many of the solid realities in your own life, your sense of belonging to a nation, your career path, your understanding of money, maybe even your very concept of who you are yourself. How much of that might actually be these elaborate, incredibly compelling shared stories that you've simply agreed, consciously or unconsciously, to believe?